on the one hand, because we cannot use wine to ferment dough. You can put wine in some flour and water, and it's not going to raise the dough by itself. If you could put it in a sealed environment where no outside yeast from the air could get to it. On the other hand, beer can be used to raise dough. Even the spent grains, as they call it, the barley grains that are used in making the beer, sometimes have been added, and this is where the very original yeast came from, was from the breweries. You very often saw a brewery and a bakery side by side in the old countries. And the reason was that the yeast from the beer allowed the bakers to raise their dough faster and have a little more control over how fast they made the bread. I'm not sure about malt vinegar, but the base ingredient in malt vinegar will raise bread, the seor. I tend to disagree, on the other hand, because one can use the wild yeast found on grape skins to make a very potent sourdough starter. And I've done that myself. I've taken grapes or raisins, and if you'll notice the white powder on the skins of the grapes, that's wild yeast. It's floating around in the air everywhere. And again, as I said, it's impossible to remove it completely, 100%. And I think there's a lesson, an object lesson in that for us today, in that we cannot 100% remove sin from our lives. But we have to realize too that yeast is not synonymous with sin. In the scriptures, it's used sometimes to signify sin, and it's used sometimes to signify the kingdom. So we have to be careful there. I've used juniper berries or cedar berries. Again, the wild yeast on the berries themselves. Not to mash the berries up in the dough, but to use that yeast to start the sourdough starter. I suppose until I find evidence one way or the other, probably we won't be drinking any wine during the Seder. It's not commanded. The only things that are commanded is the Pesach, the lamb or the goat, the bitter herbs, and the matzah. Those are the only things that are commanded for us to eat during the Chag Matzot, or during the Seder for Pesach. Excuse me. So we're not commanded to drink wine except in the oral traditions, and I'm not yay or nay on the oral traditions, except when they disagree with the scriptures. And in this instance, they do disagree on the surface with what the scriptures say. So now let us look at some more modern and potentially troubling prohibitions laid upon us by some during this season. Many teach that things such as baking powder and baking soda are prohibited from our homes during this time. Some would even go so far as to say that we cannot use egg whites during this season. And I think that this is due to an understanding of what the word seor means. Seor means fermented, but many people say that seor means puffed up. For example, we're not to be puffed up in our own understanding. We're not to be puffed up with pride. And they draw a correlation there. But that's not what the word means. So I think if we really look at it, we can see that these things are not prohibited during Pesach. as I said earlier, I was a baker by trade for a few years, and we used baking soda, baking powder in our ingredients to make things raise, especially cakes. We used egg whites sometimes in our baked products, because basically what the egg white did was it incorporated air into the baked product, and these proteins in the egg whites would become stiff and keep the air pockets there. And if you take an egg white and you beat it in a mixer at a high rate of speed, you will see that it's not the egg white itself, but it's the incorporation of the air into the egg white, and this egg white forming stiff chains that causes the quote-unquote leavening of the baked product. So if we cannot have egg whites, we could just as easily argue that we're not allowed to have air in this time of Pesach in any of our products. So that means we should not stir anything too heavily for the products and in our cooking. We would also have to prohibit butter and shortening. I learned how to make Danish from scratch, and when I worked in the bakery in Evansville, Indiana, and what we would do is we would take our dough and we would put the butter on the dough and fold it over, roll it, then fold it over again, roll it again, and go through this process a few times. And as the butter or the shortening, whichever one you use, some people use shortening or margarine in this process instead of butter. But what occurs is when the product is being baked, it creates pockets of steam in the baked product, and it causes it to raise up, to be puffed up. So if we prohibit egg whites, baking powder, and baking soda, where do we stop in this leavening? Anything that puffs up a baked product is to be prohibited. I don't think we can gather that from the definition of leaven, seor. So in conclusion, what are we to prohibit during Chag Matzot? We are to prohibit things such as sourdough starter. We are not to allow our grains to soak and to become fermented. We're not to make bread from these items. And we're not to, we should prohibit the sourdough starter especially. Active dry yeast is just a modern form of the sourdough starter. So yes, yeast would be prohibited in that sense. So if you want to prohibit the other things like baking powder, baking soda, egg whites, etc., that is your right. You can do that. I'm not telling you not to do it because it doesn't fit the definition. I'm just saying you can't command others to prohibit them either. And I think, you know, that's where we get into trouble so many times in our walk, is that there are things that we have come to an understanding that are not set out so clearly in the scriptures that are prohibited to us, like the baking powder, the baking soda, egg whites, etc. But yet we sin when we tell others that they're not allowed to use them or they are sinning. That is the problem. So until the next time, Shalom Aleichem, peace be unto you, and enjoy the upcoming Pesach and Chag HaMatzot.